Hey, adapters, welcome back. Today, our guest is Juanita Constible, the Senior Advocate for Climate and Health in the Climate and Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Juanita advocates for federal policies to protect communities and workers from the present-day harms of rising temperatures, sea level rise, and weather extremes. She has written extensively on climate change and health, including a 2020 report called On the Front Lines: Climate Change Threatens the Health of America's Workers. Juanita will discuss the occupational health hazards to workers due to climate change, particularly extreme heat. She helps identify the major factors that increase worker vulnerability to climate-related health and safety harms and how COVID-19 has elevated these problems. We'll also discuss recent changes in federal policy, and we'll get to her recommendations on future policy solutions. Hey, Juanita, welcome to the show.
Hi, Doug. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, looking forward to this conversation. We've had quite a few people on from NRDC. You guys have made yourself at home on Simpatico, so welcome indeed.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, so we've had previous people on from NRDC, but what is NRDC?
We are one of the largest environmental organizations in the US. We're headquartered in New York, but we have offices all over the country as well as in Beijing, China. And we are really focused on protecting the natural world and the people in it. And that means emphasis on all sorts of things, including worker health, endangered species, and just having clean air to breathe.
Okay, well, what is your team? We were talking a little bit earlier that, I know some of the people there like Rob Moore, and but your program, is it just you? Is it part of a bigger structure there?
Yeah, so I'm part of the Climate and Clean Energy Program, and a lot of my colleagues really focus on the emissions reduction side of climate change. So they're all about the mitigation piece. I'm part of a small, really cross-programmatic group that focuses on climate change and health and what we need to do to protect people from things like heat-related illnesses and allergies. My immediate team includes a science fellow who's working with us right now on the occupational health harms of heat and how advocates and regulators can really address those problems through good, solid construction of occupational health and safety regulations.
Okay, before we get into the impacts of climate change on workers, I'm just curious, what is your background? How did you kind of get into this position? I mean, these kind of jobs didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago.
No, and we've really seen more of an emphasis on climate change and its effects on health in really just the last 5 to 10 years. And I would say that NRDC is one of the few groups that's been working on it for a long time, but we're starting to see a lot more networks of doctors and nurses and health professionals get into it too, which I'm really excited about. So my background is actually in wildlife biology. I did not start in climate change. I certainly did not start in human health, but my work out in the natural world put me at risk. I mean, I was working out in the heat and the sun and all sorts of crazy weather. And it really brought home for me how inextricably tied we are to the climate around us. No matter how technologically advanced we get, we can't separate ourselves from that. So as I started to move into advocacy and really started to see weather extremes get worse and worse, I got increasingly interested in that intersection between our physical and mental well-being and what's happening with our climate.
Okay, so how is climate change affecting workers today? What's going on out there?
So one of the most obvious and well-documented effects so far has been heat-related illnesses and deaths. So we know that climate change is increasing the risk of heat waves. They're getting longer, more frequent, more severe. And as workers are outside in that heat, but also in unair conditioned spaces like, say, a UPS truck or an Amazon warehouse, they're increasingly experiencing not only rising baseline temperatures, but these extremes. Heat has an amazing array of effects on the body. In fact, there's a recent study that finds that it can kill you in 27 different ways. There's all these different pathways by which it affects our health. But there's a broader array of issues too. So if you think of first responders that are doing swift water rescues after floods, or wildland firefighters who are out for weeks at a time in wildfire smoke, or you think about even teachers who are working in unair conditioned classrooms, which unfortunately is far too common. there's a pretty wide array of how workers are exposed to these things that a lot of us can choose to avoid if we have the means to do so.
Okay, and this is an area that I have a bias toward too. When you think of climate change impacts, you think of sea level rise, and of course, you just
Sure.
mentioned flooding. But extreme heat, ultimately, right now, is the one that's probably it is causing most of the mortality out there. And yet, how are you working on some of these other issues, or is really your focus maybe on, I mean, extreme heat?
Well, heat's been our major focus right now, partly because there's a broad array of advocates that are also focused on this, and we can talk more about that later when we get into solutions. We also have the best data on it. I mean, if you think about some of these less well understood health impacts of climate change, like the mental health impacts of losing a few days' wage or seeing really traumatic things on the job, we have almost no information on that. But heat is something that, at least at some level, is measured. Not well, that needs to be done a lot better, but we do have at least some sense of the numbers. And as you say, heat is the biggest extreme weather killer in the US when we look at the whole population, not just workers.
Okay, so why should employers care about this? Why is it relevant to them? So,
Well, for one thing, it's really expensive when workers get sick. There's workers' compensation costs. There's maybe you have to train a new set of employees to cover temporarily or permanently a person who passes away or gets sick. There's a productivity loss. So I don't know if you've ever worked in really high temperatures, even having the AC go out in your office, but there's some studies that suggest that extreme heat can reduce a worker's productivity by about 30%. Fundamentally, though, employers also have a moral and legal responsibility to take care of their workers. There's unfortunately a little too much of treating people like they're just exchangeable parts, they're
mm,
disposable goods. And what I'd like to posit to employers is that if you hire someone, you should take care of them.
that seems reasonable. Okay, well, so you're there working, and I know maybe we'll talk about federal solutions in a little bit, but what's the infrastructure in place to protect workers, and how do you kind of interact to even make change in this situation?
Yeah, so it's at the federal level, it's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and there is an overarching law called the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. That law largely protects private sector workers, but there's a bunch of exceptions. For example, small family farms aren't covered under that. The military isn't covered under that. Then there's something like 28 states that have a state plan that their state OSHA puts together and has to be approved at the federal level. And those are a patchwork where sometimes they protect just private sector workers, sometimes they include state and local public sector workers, so government workers. But it's, again, there's a ton of exceptions. So it's this weird patchwork from state to state. And in the states that don't have a state plan, local and state government workers are not afforded any sort of occupational safety and health protections. They're completely falling through the cracks. So when OSHA gets a complaint from an employee or a union member, they sometimes investigate, sometimes don't. And of course, if they find some sort of infraction of the law, they can impose penalties on those employers. The penalties really vary in terms of severity, and often, depending on state and federal law associated with it, the employers can knock those penalties down. They can negotiate a smaller settlement. So what that means is, well, I should also point out actually that there are not enough inspectors to go around. So
Mm.
we just do not have enough enforcement of the existing laws on the books. So there are laws. They've certainly helped reduce worker deaths and injuries across all sorts of different kinds of causes. But there's far too many workers that are still being left behind. And with the COVID pandemic, that has gotten even worse.
Okay, so you mentioned workers falling through the cracks. I imagine migrant workers even more so.
That's right. Yeah. So one perfect example is the H-2A workers. So they're the workers that are brought in specifically for farm work. So employers are supposed to provide housing, transportation, food often to those workers. but the quality of the housing really varies incredibly. And one thing we see when it comes to heat, particularly, is that sometimes the housing is just terrible quality, too hot. And so those workers are out in the sun all day, in the heat all day, and then they go home to hot conditions at night. And unfortunately, with accumulated heat exposure throughout the day, your risk of heat related illness goes way up.
I'm curious because we hear more about extreme heat being a killer and impacting, but this recent freezing event, and people are tying it to climate change. Is that a focus area? Is it, well, freezing doesn't happen that often? I'm just curious how it's getting kind of lost. I think that yes, climate change probably is a driver in these sort of extreme events. Does that play into what the work that you're doing?
So we have not been, my team has not been specifically focused on extreme cold. The science is still pretty fuzzy. It's one of the more controversial areas when it comes to extremes. But I think the lesson of the cold snap right now is that we kind of have to be prepared for everything. There's this idea that if it didn't happen much in the history, we don't have to worry about it now. And you know that better than anyone. So we really have to think more broadly about what a worst case scenario actually looks like. And a lot of the kinds of measures that would be required now to keep people safe from the cold in Texas are actually very similar to
Mhm.
heat or hurricanes, giving them a safe place to go, making sure they have food, making sure they have transportation to get somewhere else in their unsafe conditions. So there's a lot of overlap.
Okay, so you've written about this, about helping, public sector workers and healthcare employees reach their potential as resilient workers. And I like that term. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so a lot of adaptation conversations tend to focus on the physical infrastructure, like seawalls or making sure our roads are elevated or our houses are weatherized. But one of the things that our allies, particularly in the labor world, talk about is workers as social infrastructure. So workers like nurses and teachers and librarians help provide the services and basically contribute to the overall well-being of the community. There's also the fact that all that physical infrastructure needs someone to build it. So when we think about workers as being part of the resilience solution, as being resilience workers, they're doing all the hard work that we need to do to get our country in a better place when it comes to future climate impacts.
Okay, so what about the similarities between, COVID-19? How has that been a driver in the work that you're doing on the climate change side?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing is some common roots between the COVID pandemic and the vulnerabilities to climate change. So we've already talked a little bit about the enforcement problem and how there's a lot of gaps in our existing laws when it comes to occupational safety and health. There's also been this emphasis for a long time on fixing the worker instead of fixing the work. So it's like, well, you didn't wear your mask, therefore it's your own fault that you got sick, versus changing the workplace so that it's a safer environment overall. There's also been this longstanding attack on legal rights of workers to collectively bargain for themselves. So, one of the things we know from repeated research is that workers who can band together can call for better protections and get them. And employers have been, unfortunately, across a lot of industries, have been systematically trying to deny workers those rights. And finally, there's the question of a broken safety net. Too often workers have to choose between their paycheck and their health. And that's true of COVID, and it's true of extreme heat, and it's true of getting out the door when there's a hurricane bearing down on your neighborhood.
I guess I haven't thought about that and I haven't heard much, but are unions pretty good when it comes to climate change? If collectively union heads and such, are they out there talking about climate change right now?
So there's a huge diversity in the labor union world, and I would not want to speak for for them
Are there
because I'm not
some good
not part of that
examples, I
team.
guess?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, SEIU is one example of a union that's been really forward thinking on not only the reducing emissions part, but on the adaptation part. And in fact, they've been one of the major drivers of this concept of social infrastructure. No surprise, they represent a lot of public sector workers who are not getting the protections they need and are vital to our climate resilience. So they're one example. It's complicated because of course we are going to see a transition as the energy system changes, as we move to hopefully more, changing the way we do business. And so there's some trepidation and there's some excitement and a lot in between.
I had a conversation with someone from the Cato Institute. I'm not familiar with it's, it's a libertarian, and we were talking adaptation, and
Mm,
we were talking about the big heat wave in France. Remember, like in the or
yeah,
like 15,000 people died. And I want to ask you too
yeah.
how maybe that is influencing some of your work. But the guy from Cato, his response was like, well, air conditions. That's how they're going to adapt to climate change, and that was sort of his response. And I get that as sort of people's immediate health. Air conditions can solve a lot of those problems, but then in the bigger picture, gosh, we're just putting a big pulse of carbon with all this new electricity demand. Has that come into play when you think of, like, let's say, maladaptation?
Sure. So, I mean, just to be really clear, air conditioning is a critically important tool to keeping workers safe, but it does not help farm workers. It does not help the folks that are up on power poles trying to restore our electricity. It doesn't help our mail deliverers who are walking the streets. So, it only goes so far. And it is a major source of emissions. Now, we do a whole bunch of work on energy efficiency at NRDC, as well as, the super coolants that, or, super warmers that are used to run air conditioning and refrigeration units. So we're trying to make air conditioning more available to people, but also less polluting so that it doesn't have this completely maladaptive effect.
There's probably going to be that tension just in the, I guess, in the immediate future too. Is like, well,
Yeah.
people's immediate health it overrides the concern. Well, in the long term, we're contributing. I mean, I get why. Okay, we're going to put AC units in these homes because it's going to help people.
Yeah, but there's also, I mean, there are a lot of uh, there's passive cooling and there's other ways to address the problem so that air conditioning can be part of the solution but doesn't have to be run as often or um, you know as much during as much time of the day. One of the things that we haven't done a lot of work on but have been talking about more and more is the urban heat island effect, where parts of downtown core are way hotter than the surrounding rural areas. So how do you make sure that the ambient temperature, the outdoor temperature, is gets taken down a notch so that people don't have to run their air conditioning as often to stay safe? Along with that, we're also looking at energy affordability, because some people have air conditioners but can't afford to run them. And if they have to choose between food and keeping their house cool, probably going to choose food.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the policies at the federal level that should change. What are you working on? What would you like to see?
Yeah, so one of the pieces that we've been working on a lot with partners at Public Citizen, United Farm Workers, and others is passing a law that would direct the federal OSHA to make a heat safety standard. So right now, there is no safety standard that's specific to keeping workers safe from heat. Instead, there's this general catch-all regulation that's like anything dangerous, but that's hard to enforce. And in fact, we've already seen some legal pushback on trying to use that specifically for heat. So OSHA has been reluctant to take that on, and we're hoping that a little congressional pressure will help change their minds. We also are just looking broadly at those worker rights issues I was talking about. So one thing NRDC has supported is the Protecting Right to Organize Act, which was introduced last year and just reintroduced a couple weeks ago. And that, among other things, would impose civil penalties on employers that illegally retaliate against workers that are trying to collectively bargain. So we're trying to see this as the climate specific things, and then also the broader, kind of root causes of vulnerability that would help not only adapt to climate change, but just deal with a lot of longstanding problems that have plagued workers.
Well, that's interesting. And what is that in NRDC's histories, like the issue of maybe the climate change and extreme heat, that if you just allow people to organize and make that easier for folks, we're going to solve, like you just said, this not necessarily, well, there is a straight line, but is that in NRDC's past, like, focusing on, I guess, labor issues?
Yeah, We've long supported them, but maybe not very publicly. I would say that's a
Okay.
more recent shift for us. I mean, the pandemic has, I think, opened a lot of people's eyes to a lot of intersecting problems, and we really see, some of the deep social and demographic issues that um, make people unsafe to environmental things are can be also addressed not just with environmental laws and regulations, if that makes sense.
Sure. And so I'm sure you're busy enough thinking about federal regulations, but you'd mentioned 28 states have some sort of form of OSHA that they're, and what do the other states do? They just have nothing?
Oh no, they also have OSHA as well, but the enforcement of those
Okay.
regulations happens federally. So we have seen some action on heat stress standards at the state level as well. California, Washington, and Minnesota all have their own version of a heat stress standard, although they vary widely and in effectiveness and in form and function. Oregon's governor last year put out an executive order directing their labor department to actually establish heat and wildfire smoke standards, which we think is great. California also has a wildfire smoke standard that has been temporary, and I can't recall if it's permanent or not, but I can find that out if anyone's interested. And Maryland is also working on a heat stress standard right now.
Well, so a lot of these OSHA rules and I guess laws have been around a while. Is there any
Mhm.
need to kind of go back in and include language about climate change, or you can get things done more at the sort of, rulemaking level? I mean,
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you asked that because most of the regulations, yeah, there's been a lot of recent ones or refreshes of ones, but they weren't exactly established with climate change in mind. So one of the things that we'd like to see, for example, is taking another look at the various standards to protect first responders after disasters. There's a couple rules on the books about toxic exposures, but there's nothing about making sure that you have an evacuation plan to get your workers out if it looks like it's not going to be safe. So we think that there's a broader need to evaluate rules and regulations with climate in mind. And one of the things that makes me hopeful is that the Biden administration is really taking a whole of government approach to climate change. So that really opens a door for labor and OSHA to be part of that.
okay, I got a question here from Mike. What would be the reason for reluctance to protecting employees from heat? And I guess, he's saying from OSHA, and I guess maybe OSHA's reluctance to doing these things.
Well, it's complicated. It's not it sounds like a straightforward rulemaking, like just keep people cool. But of course, you have to design a standard that works for indoor and outdoor environments, all sorts of industries. There's pushback from industry, and OSHA has to balance multiple stakeholders, just like any other government agency. They've also had their hands full, especially in the last year with the pandemic. But I think, OSHA does have a heat safety awareness campaign that they've been operating now since I think 2014, and they are making efforts to improve that now. So I'm hopeful that that's a first step towards an eventual standard.
Okay, just a little follow up for Mike too. And what kind of, you sort of answered this, but if you could elaborate, what kind of standards are safe for heat stress?
Um, what kind of I don't quite understand the question. Sorry, Mike.
What kind of standards are safe for heat? I guess maybe he's talking about universal standards, and I imagine that geographically and industries, you're going to have
Mm.
different standards and such for what heat stress ultimately means. Maybe that's what I think he's saying.
Sure. So that's also one of the problems. So there are so many different ways to measure heat stress, and something like 100 different indices associated with
Hmm.
just how people perceive heat. So, but there are some basic things that we know people need. They need rest, they need shade, and they need water. And it doesn't really matter whether the temperature is 85 or 95 because everyone's tolerance for heat is a little bit different. So making sure that you've built in those basic protections as well as training workers, And this is so critical, having a responsive plan that if someone starts to show the signs of heat stress, that you get them first aid or to a hospital as soon as possible. So that exact definition, there are several recommendations on the book, and that's one of the things OSHA is going to have to sort out, like what's going to work most effectively for the broadest range of industries.
Okay, so we're almost done here, but I wanted to get one more question here from Ken. Is the EU or any nations in Europe or elsewhere implementing policies that can protect workers from climate-related risks? I guess, do they do it better in other parts of the world?
The EU has definitely been ahead of us on heat safety standards. I can't speak to the details of them, but if folks are interested in learning more, I'd really recommend the Global Heat Health Information Network. It's this voluntary network of practitioners and scientists, and they have this great series on protecting workers from heat, and a lot of the speakers are from the EU. So that would be a good place to start for more information.
Okay, so this is just blown by, but I guess to sort of end this here, what's next for you? What are you going to be working on, I guess, over the next 3 to 6 months? And if anyone had any additional questions or wanted some resources that you work on, where could they go?
Sure. So for resources, check out our website, www.nrdc.org. It's sometimes easiest to Google exactly what you want. So Google my name and NRDC, and you'll find all the stuff that I've been working on worker health. We'll definitely be working with and pushing the administration over the next few months on getting this uh, making sure that they live up to their promise of this whole government approach to climate change, trying to get that heat illness legislation passed that I talked about. And my science fellow and I are working to untangle the exciting things that she's finding in her research so that as states and as federal OSHA look to develop a heat safety standard, we can help inform that with lessons learned from places where they already exist.
Okay, so I got a couple more questions. I'm going to ask them when
Sure.
we go to just chatting, but this has
Okay.
been a fabulous conversation, Juanita. I truly appreciate it and the work that you're doing at NRDC. But you hold on just a sec, but thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.